Hi, I'm Simone. I use she, her.
I'm Sasika, I use she, they pronouns.
I'm Aiden, he, him.
And I'm Nomi, she, her, and our group name is Stan.
Yay! So we're going to be talking about The Night of the Living Dead. It's a 1968 horror sci-fi film directed by George A. Romeo. It features people who have seemingly no common ground forced to isolate within one home during a zombie apocalypse in Pennsylvania. The director is well known artistically for taking advantage of typical low budget limitations, which what we'll be focusing on that in this discussion. It's an iconic film known for bridging the gap between film noirs and modern day slashers.
So, one of the main themes of the movie is that basically the low budget and the plot, the narrative have to be intertwined at all times. So, for me, a main thing watching the film was that it seemed very obvious that when writing a movie like this, that one has to know that it will be low budget, because I think if it wasn't, a lot of the choices, the artistic choices in the film would be very different. And so I think the fact that they're intertwined is very visible and obvious, but also gives a lot of creative opportunity, or forces creative opportunities in different realms of the film.
Yeah, totally. I wanted to add on that actually is like that scene where Barb is running away from that the first zombie in the first act, I believe. It was just so it was almost comical, like we discussed earlier, right? It was almost comical the way that the camera is angled, and it's just so much of her running, but the like because of the low budget, they were forced to do that. So yeah.
Okay, so I feel like the main thing that I felt knowing that we're watching this as a low budget movie is that it's totally intertwined with the plot itself. I think creating a movie like this would be impossible not knowing the budget ahead. And so a lot of the narrative points are like entirely dependent on the low budget, and the low budget is, so they're entirely intertwined. I think in setting specifically, it's especially emphasized, like the fact that the whole film takes place in one confined house. That's like a huge money saver for them, and it also then means it's sort of like a chain effect of it then meaning that the characters don't have to change costumes, and they don't have to be upkept with like hair and makeup and stuff. And yeah.
Yeah, they only had about $114,000, which is less than a million in today's currency. So, as you said, that really made sure they needed efficient use of their space and planning ahead in terms of dialogue and camera work and lighting. Everything needed to be intertwined and understood beforehand so that they could properly flow through every scene.
Yeah, I totally second that. Oh, do you want to go ahead or?
Sure, I just think an interesting position, because you already mentioned the location. There's mainly, I would say, three main locations and one main location and three minor ones. The house being the main one, the graveyard running from that. There's the cellar, and then the gas pump. And within each of these, there's dialogue that is based in these settings that is very crucial to that. The settings serve as half of the plot points.
I totally agree with that. And one thing that you actually just like made me think of is the fact that all of these locations, like these are four different, settings you said, are all on one property. So like the fact that they were able to create such like a compelling film with just that one being on one property was really interesting to me. Like especially when they were stuck in the house, like the first scene of Barb and Ben in the house, it was just so awful. Like I felt like I needed to escape. Like it creates the such a tense atmosphere that you can't get rid of because the majority of the film is inside of the house.
I think that tenseness is really accentuated by the score and the way that they effectively use the soundtrack. I think half the time they're either speaking about the threat that is presenting them, and when they're not speaking, still there's a very efficient use of the soundtrack. Either there's some threatening music, or there's the radio or the TV playing, telling us about how the threat is getting worse.
I think it's sort of interesting that you say that. Like, I think the sound of the television sort of provides continuity, and in a way, and in other films, the continuity is like provided over like different locations and like um transitions between those locations that that would be typical. But in this film, they use sound as a large element, and they really emphasize that to provide a basis for continuity. And um on that, they also like sound in, especially in the beginning when Barb is running away from the zombie, the soundtrack is so intense. It's like the main thing that you hear. And when she goes into the house, the telephone ringing is super loud, the one track almost. And so it was like the blood dripping. And I think they use that as a way to rely on sound versus other elements, which
Yeah,
yeah.
would agree. Even when she sees that mutilated face at the top of the stairs, has that really like jarring like crescendo that reverbed a bunch of times, and they use that same shot twice, but it still had the same effect. I feel it still held the same weight, just based on the context it was given.
Yeah, that's something I also felt like. I think there were a lot of things like that weird like skull between the stairs that felt very sort of cliche and cheap almost. Well, they were cheap, um, obviously, but I think once you actually analyze what those things do, it's much more powerful than it seems when you're watching the movie. Um, like all the like tilted shots, like the angled shots of Barbara on the stairs, for example. Like all those things feel very like low budget horror movie um, cliche. And I think in a way, like when audiences came to watch a movie like that, they expected something um, almost shallow. And I think again, this goes back to the plot that it forced them to sort of watch like, and in the movie there are like very um symbolic scenes that take place, like for example, and this is like moving on to a totally different topic, but Ben hitting Harry. I think the casting choice of Ben as a black man, which they didn't do it completely intentionally, but also totally changes the meaning of the movie. So I think anyway, going back to the all the sort of like cliche choices that they make, this movie is sort of advertised as a very as something that's very appealing and approachable to common audiences. And then especially at the time of the civil rights movement, this came out in 68, so it's like during the civil rights movement, and it's sort of talking about topics that are very relevant at the time and still very relevant, but still advertising itself as something not cheap, but like very mainstream sort of. And it's managing still to insert very heavy and loaded scenes and images.
Yeah, just to back up on your point of like the sort of almost cringiness, as you put it, I think that's how you put it, of the film, is the budget kind of forcing them to commit to the corniness, because horror films can have, at any level, no matter how serious it is, kind of is dumb. Like, to refer to a modern day film like It, when Pennywise is doing that dance like on stage, look in the sewers, it's kind of crazy. Like, it looks stupid. And I feel like because this film doesn't take itself exceedingly seriously, it's able to deal with that, with those budget issues in that way, even with through the sounds, because that loud sound when Barb finds the dead body, it's like why are we yelling? That's what it feels like why are we yelling? But because because it does that, because if it was like silent, or it had like, like how a regular horror movie to scare you would just be dead silent, it would be funny. But because it's so loud, it's still jarring, and you could tell that that clearly fake skull can still scare somebody. So that was interesting.
I think that also like with the action, like how you guys were talking about how it's sort of like cliche. I think they took advantage of that by, like making the action exceedingly slow and not showing the faces of the zombies. I think they took advantage of that in a really nice way that sort of made it feel like not showing the faces of the zombies. It makes us question, like, are they being killed? Like, what's happening? And that's much more intriguing for the audience. And then to see the jarring image afterwards of the injury, is that juxtaposition, I think, is really um that helps, is artistic. And also, um yeah, I think I have more to say about this, but I will.
Something Sasika just made me think of, especially with the budget. I think many times, because of the constraint, there wasn't much room for subtlety. I feel like subtlety was something, a luxury that wasn't exactly able to be afforded, because you really need to convey this message based on the limitations you have. Um, I think with the acting and the dialogue, Barb oftentimes seemed over the top, but we really felt her presence and what was trying to be conveyed as a shocked observer. We could relate to her as an audience perspective, kind of just watching along. Um, Her shock kind of amplified this environment that maybe the zombies alone wouldn't do. Um, in the same way, I feel the soundtrack is doing the same thing. These sounds that may seem out of place but are completely shocking and jarring in that initial moment.
Yeah, I totally get that. And actually, specifically, that reminds me of the phone calls, like in the very beginning, once again, when Ben and Barb were trying to call somebody, and the phone had this really weird dial tone, like almost very sci-fi like, it doesn't sound like a typical dial tone. I feel like that's another choice that they made to make it more off-putting, because if they used a regular dial tone, first of all, it would sound like it was coming out of any sitcom, because I'm pretty sure that they bought all of these. They were not made, all these sound effects. So it was a very unique choice.
Also, going back to what Simone was saying, I think um, the not showing constantly what is the action, like the injuries and like the fighting between the zombies and the people, I think not only is it an artistic choice, it also is sort of inevitable because it's so much easier than um, actually showing, what's going on. But I think the fact that most of the film takes place during the nighttime, and a lot of it is like very dark. Like all the shots of the zombies outside, and their faces are sort of like half like scarred and half, not lit at all. And then also the cellar, the fact that the cellar is mainly dark. Um, I think not only is it like symbolic artistically, um, but it also does like sort of intensify the mystery around it all, around the violence, which actually feels not cheap at all. Like, I think usually the cheap thing to do would be to sort of like show all the gore and like, which, sometimes does happen when the zombies are like eating the guts and stuff. But I think it's actually like a, inexpensive way to do something that's really sophisticated.
I think like about the darkness, like you said, with the camera, there's lots of limitations with the visibility that they have. And I think that in some parts of the film, they're able to like, that contributes to the mystery of what the zombies are doing when you can't exactly see their full silhouettes. But then at times it allows for this like intense show of contrast with their white faces against the dark background, and they can also utilize the lighting. And also about the action thing, I think it's sort of it contributes to the slow, like I think it really works well with the fact that they are zombies, the fact that you aren't exactly seeing everything, it's really the slow process. So I think that helps you. I guess we could talk more about the lighting if there's anything you guys want to add about that lighting and camera.
I think, especially with being a black and white film, there's a level of no color, but black and white saturation that can be used. A lot of contrast that really accentuates certain moments. There was when the first lightning hit, it was really reliant on the sound effect and then just a close light flashing on his face. And then also that moment where Mr. Cooper is looking through the window and he's watching the car explode and it blinds him. And before that, it was mostly dark and split lighting where half of his face was illuminated. It's minimal lights used and not very complex effects, but still based on high light versus low light. You still have that feeling and can see the feeling of like actual lightning or witnessing a car crash, a car explosion.
Yeah, to add on that point, that high contrast lighting definitely added a lot to the film. Like I've been thinking a lot if they use like low contrast, high key lighting, this film would not be scary at all. Like at all. Especially in those violent scenes, like Simone said earlier, that scene where like every time Ben viciously kills a zombie, you don't get to see anything. You just see him from above just going ham. That definitely adds to that high contrast lighting really adds drama for sure.
I mean, we also talked about this in class, but I think the choice at all, or sort of not really choice because it is due to budget, but to film this movie in black and white is like more than just the lighting aspect of it. I think people at the time, most of the films in theater were in color. And so I think people associated black and white movies with a certain feeling that maybe felt either more raw and real because, war footage was all in black and white, or um, and like home footage. I mean, I don't actually know how it worked back then, but I think there was, I think it does something beyond just the visual aspect of it. It actually like touches people, like subconsciously makes people feel very intensely without actually thinking about it, which is a really powerful thing.
Yeah, I think like the feeling of rawness, like you said, they utilize like in the beginning when Barbara's running away, the score is going on for almost like uncomfortably long, and it sort of adds to this raw feeling, and it makes it feel like very present and candid, like she's really going through this, it's going on forever, it's not going to end. And also like the isolated shots of the TV, that's also feels very, it gives this raw feeling. I guess, and we can also talk more about the TV. I think there's more things to say about that as
well. Okay, so that definitely on that TV thing, it's a big part that I noticed. It was a great way that they were able to place a lot of background. First of all, just blurb literally to explain the entire story in like less than 20 minutes it was a really great decision money wise. And it also really made it feel like it was happening everywhere because you keep seeing the same halls in the same house or the same like 3 feet away from the house. You don't really get to see, all these other people going through it, but seeing it go on national television, that really felt like wow, this is happening all over the country.
Going to the actual physical TV, I thought it was interesting that all the shots of the TV were either close-ups or statics where it was only the TV in frame. and no actor. There's no over-the-shoulder shots of an actor and watching the TV, which is kind of contrast to most of the dynamic Dutch angles and such that they showed otherwise of everyone in these different positions to utilize just the space of the house. I kind of think it saved time and money to just have the footage play on the TV without any interference that would cause them to then reshoot. And I also think there was a lot of that use of static shots in terms of in the house and dialogue, many interesting angles to utilize the space. It wasn't like the same side profile, same angle every time. There was always a new one I found. And I like that they were all static because then it showed a lot of contrast for when action occurred. Because I feel like in most action that I watch now, when there's conflict or like violence, there's a lot of cuts. But here, it was more continuous, and instead, it wasn't steady shots. It was like handheld, shaky, which kind of emphasized the anxiety of the moment, even if the action was slow itself.
I also think, going back to the TV, the fact that it was like the shots of the TV were literally just the frame of the TV and the image on it. I think that also, like, not adding any sort of shaky over the shoulder shots was just made you feel like it was literally also on our, like, watching the movie, it was on our screen as if we were watching it ourselves. Like, it wasn't tilted in any way. It was completely like straight on, which made it feel like we were the ones watching it, which I think is also the inexpensive thing to do, but it subconsciously is a really sophisticated choice to make the audience feel like they are really there. And also the TV choice in general is, I think, another example of the sort of forced because it's all, the movie takes place in one location mainly. Yeah, it's just like another way of sort of informing the audience, like still within this location, which is really creative.
Yeah, since it all takes place in one house, like they're really forced to utilize like different household items that can have an important effect on the audience. Like we said, the phone, the things that they use to board up the house, the TV, like, and the cellar. They're all use these in really creative ways. And also, one thing I noticed was that in when they were boarding up the house, they would just use, like, there was just a door laying around that they would just use to like board up the windows instead of like actually like ripping apart the location to make it more realistic. But obviously they probably couldn't afford to damage any sort of property. And also, yeah.
Yeah, on that note, they always seem to have what they needed. Like, oh, let me go into this different room. Oh, we found a TV. Oh, we found mason jars to make Molotov cocktails. Um, it was there wasn't much conflict in finding the actual items. It was more about what to do when you have these items. It was more about the decision making and the internal conflict between the people.
I think this also goes back to how the plot is totally intertwined with the low budget, because when you think about it, there is sort of a very specific sort of house that this could be, where like all of these things are available to them, yet the house itself is not sort of luxurious and like, you know, it's not like a rich person's house. It's sort of just like an average home. And I think it's sort of a very specific way, because it feels like it was just lived in, which it was, like, due to the plot. Like, I think someone just, like, the zombies killed whoever lived there right before, and then it's like very conveniently, you know, they have all these things, yet it's not there's nothing super expensive.
Yeah, talking about approaches to like what they have. One thing that really stuck with me was the scene where the zombies are eating, you know, their roasted couple after the vehicle blows up. So I found that really interesting the way they shot that. They kind of shot it. It felt like I was watching a nature documentary when the zombies were, eating that flesh. And I was wondering like what are if we could all go around and say our opinions on that and like why they would do that. I thought it was just because they wanted to do like they just wanted to do something different when it comes to such like aggressive violence. Like cannibalism is a lot. So I just thought that they would do that approach instead. So people are more horrified, but they don't have to go close and realize that the liver doesn't really look like a liver.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you said. I think it's just a creative way to capture that. Um, it, yeah, yes, I feel like you said it all.
I mean, yeah, I think it's just something. I think it's just something really shocking. Obviously, the guts are very realistic because, as said in class, they were from a butcher's shop, so like it was a bit shocking. But I guess it also there's sort of this like like when after Ben is like alone in the house, and then there's just an immediate cut to the outside of the house. The birds are chirping, everything's nice. Like I think it sort of has to do with like the zombies being sort of human, and this like do we sort of sympathize, and it's like there's always this contradiction between um is it like you said, it was like a nature documentary, like in a way it should not have been filmed in that way to make it seem like a pretty scene is going on. I think it sort of has to do with this contradiction, like yeah.
Yeah, I really think it's about shock value. I really like that setup shot where it was within the burning car, looking up at all the zombies reaching in, and then after that, there's just so many shots of them eating the actual flesh. And I think it's really about using what they have to the fullest. We have access to these guts. Let's use many shots of them because that's actually shocking. But the same with that I think that same mentality is seen throughout the film, especially as we talked earlier about how they were using the objects within the house. Like that one table that you see Ben breaking apart in the beginning. He takes apart all the legs and then he uses the actual table part to board up a door. And he uses each leg as a torch. And there's that one shot where he puts sets the chair on fire and throws a torch on it. And they use the same shot twice. And you can see that the torch is already on the chair before he throws it because they couldn't reshoot the shot and set another chair on fire because I guess it would cost too much, or they already did it once.
Yeah, I also noticed they use the same shots a couple of times. Like when they're watching TV and there's a shot from below of Ben's face looking at the TV, and then a few shots later they just inserted the same one again, which I thought was funny. I didn't notice it upon watching the movie for the first time, but I think it is like sort of a really smart way, because why would they film it twice? I mean, it's like very much undetectable, I think, for people watching, especially for the first time. I don't think, like, unless you were like looking for it, I don't think anyone would really notice that. um and yeah, it was also just a really nice camera. It was just really like with the contrast of his face and like the ceiling. So I just don't see why not, and I think it's, again, it's like sort of forced creativity. um yeah.
Oh, I guess before anything, I wanted to see if we wanted to touch on dialogue at all because I feel like that's an interesting thing. Um, I feel like they a lot of the arguments seemed like it's two sides, and like we know this information, it's more for themselves. Um, it's more just stubborn people being stubborn and not necessarily um, stimulating for the audience. But I think it played into the conflict of being theatrical and also maybe subtle messaging.
Like when you say like you thought that the dialogue just was not exactly stimulating for like the audience, or it was more like of a conversation between the two.
Yeah, it's more to show their exact positioning, show, oh, Ben's taking care of everything. Oh, Barb's flustered and annoyed. Mr. Cooper just wants to protect his family and he's staying inside, he's staying in the cellar. And
You know,
everybody else.
actually,
Right, right. I agree. I think it's like I think the simplicity is like helps in making the plot go quicker so that they can just easily, you know, because they can't they a longer film would be mean a higher budget
I
sometimes.
actually thought that the lack of dialogue was because, I mean, the lack of substance in the dialogue was to save for budget one, and like maybe they can afford like good enough writers, but mostly just because this whole film seems like an observation of what's happening rather than putting you in the character's perspective. Because like, you know, a lot of movies, the majority of movies, you're like in the character's head, but all these characters, you're just watching what's happening in the house. Of course, you follow Barb in the beginning, but it really feels like you can't break into their actual psyche and feel what they're feeling because it's all an observation. I feel like that's where the weird nature documentary style recording comes in. And like you're talking about Ben, like, you know, violence and then butterflies outside. I think it all has to do with that stuff. So yeah. And I think we are running out of time.
And that's all, folks.